Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Celina Caesar-Chavannes. Celina is a business consultant, coach, international speaker, former member of parliament, and the author of Can You Hear Me Now? Known for championing mental health, equity, justice, gender issues, and her expertise in transformative leadership, she has garnered numerous accolades during her tenure, including being recognized by O Magazine and Chanteline Magazine. Given Celina's passion about empowering leaders with the tools to make justice universally accessible and her extensive experience, I'm excited to have her share her experience with you. So, welcome, Celina. Can you tell us a little bit about how you discovered your passion or your niche?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It really is a pleasure to be on this program discussing the leader within, because I think that understanding that helps you find your passion and your niche. I think for me, it was really uncovering the 3-year-old version of Celina. The version of, she's around 3 to 5, the version that's uninhibited, unapologetic, swears, is not afraid to get in trouble, is just so unafraid of the world. And then the world kind of made her afraid and apologetic. And I put her away because she always got into trouble, and just muted her and muted her and muted her until she disappeared. And I think finding or reconnecting with that version of me, which I call the most powerful version of me, is really what helped me to start the process of finding my passion again, which ultimately leads to my purpose.
Love it. And were there leaders or mentors along the way that kind of helped you get comfortable with bringing that 3 to 5 year old version out again? And what were the attributes of these leaders or mentors?
So this might be a little bit of a different twist on it, because I would say that the people that antagonized me the most were the ones that caused that little Celina that was in to like break free and say, why are you taking somebody bullying you? Why are you taking harassment? Why are you making yourself small to accommodate spaces that were never designed for you in the first place? Why are you muting your voice? How did we turn into this version? And I think it was the individuals or the leaders that were around me that were so unapologetic, but unapologetic in a way that was almost dismissive to me, continued to marginalize me. And in those moments of what I call awakening, people call it acts of resistance, or, pushing back against the status quo or breaking glass ceilings. I call those moments really those moments of awakening where you come into your true self, you come into your own self, your own power, because you are in spaces where people are pushing you and cracking you a little bit more and breaking you a little bit more. And then that person, that power is released.
I appreciate you sharing that. And you talked about how this world isn't really designed for, let's just say, a visible minority. And even I was chatting with one of my girlfriends recently. She's an entrepreneur, a mom of a toddler, doing her PhD. And she's like, this world is not built for a working mom, right? Like at the end of it. And that's why she chooses the endeavors that she does. So for someone like you who's had success in business and academia and consulting, etc., what are some systems or processes that have helped you to better play in the sandbox that ultimately wasn't built for us?
Right. So if you asked me this question 20 years ago, I would give you a long list of things that tells you how to play within the sandbox. This year I'm turning 50, and I'm at a totally different point in my life where I'm perfectly okay with the margins. So I don't play in sand anymore. I'm over the sand thing. And it's interesting because right now I'm doing my PhD in consciousness and humanization, and reading Michael Foucault's work around discipline and punish. He actually, and for anybody of your listeners who wants to read this book, he actually talks about how our systems are all designed from a penal system, like from prison, where you have supervision, you have times in which you need to go out for lunch and come in and go to sleep, and you have hierarchy, and you only, could go out for good behavior when you behave yourself. That sounds like our workspaces. That sounds like our schools. And so these systems are designed for us to be docile. Their systems are designed for us to compete or to be a productive member of a capitalist society. And so when I also read the counter to that, bell hooks, all about love, or feminist theory from margin to center from bell hooks, it talks about the fact that we, as I'm a Black woman, have a very specific vantage point because we see the center, but we also see what it's like in the margins, in our safe spaces, in the spaces that we design for us, and what that feels like, what peace feels like there, what love feels like there, what compassion feels like there. So it's not necessarily that I'm playing in the sandbox anymore, but I know that the sandbox was not designed for me, and therefore I frame what I expect from the sandbox differently because I could always go back to the margin and find love and peace and joy.
I love that mindset. It's a completely different way of thinking that we're ultimately not conditioned to think that way, right?
No.
And based on your experience and just what you're learning right now, like what is one piece of advice that you would offer leaders when it comes to creating environments that embrace this mindset?
So there's a couple of things. Number one is we often say that, people like ourselves, women of color with multiple intersecting identities that are often marginalized, are, marginalized, oppressed, while others have power. The power is in the center. If you look at the Wheel of Power by Sylvia Duckworth, you have like people, these often marginalized intersecting identities at the periphery, and people, white men at the center with power. But we've had to navigate heteronormative spaces that were not designed for us and do it successfully. Is that not power? Is that not strength? We've had to navigate mistakes with grace. We've had to overcome barriers to build resilience in ourselves. We've had to have hurts that helped us define our purpose. We've had to have pains that actually made us understand our passions. Is that not powerful? So for leaders to actually embrace this kind of mindset, you have to look at power differently and see the power that we bring is a different set of power. It's a different set of strength and resilience that has come over years of mistakes and hurts and barriers and everything else that has built an extreme amount of grace in our capacity. But also at the same time, understanding that culture eats any kind of strategy for breakfast. And that's not my saying, that's Peter Drucker. And my advice for leaders is you have to create a culture by which, and this is work done by Laura Morgan Roberts, who talks about being in spaces where you're able to be free, you're able to become, you're able to fade, and you're able to fail, right? So I have all this power that I've created through my experiences and expertise, but I go into a space where I'm the only Black woman there. I can't fade. You know how difficult it is to not find the one chocolate chip that's in a cookie? I'm the one chocolate chip in a chocolate chip cookie. I can't fade. I can't be sick. I can't have an off day. I have to be on and happy and going all the time. And leaders need to understand that we need to become, fade, and fail, but also understand the power that we bring to these spaces at the same time.
Thank you for that visual, by the way. I'm like, oh yeah. And when you talked a little bit about that, it made me think like, why do you think leaders have such difficulties embracing that culture when you just mentioned like culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Especially as they're going through growing pains or changes and stuff like that.
So this is the tough one, and this is what I do a lot of my work with in corporations. Is that we talk about you know DEI, equity, diversity, inclusion. That is such a low bar. We are so much better than that. The bar that we want to set for ourselves is justice, a just society where everybody could become, fail, fade, be 100% their true selves. Now, how do we get rid of those barriers? Well, we say, policy is in the way, and, legislation, and, our, written and unwritten rules. But who makes those policies and written rules and unwritten rules? People do. So the biggest barrier to success around these strategies that we know are going to create a higher return on investment for organizations, have outperforming organizations and outperforming teams, make sure that we have better decision making. All of those things happen when we remove the one biggest barrier that exists, and that is ourselves. And Daniel Goleman talks about um, the fact that emotional intelligence is 2 times more important than technical or cognitive skills when it comes to leadership within workspaces. And as you go higher up in organizations where your technical skill and your cognitive skill is really negligible compared to the other person, you're all on the same level, you're all smart, but it's your emotional intelligence that's going to be 2 times more valuable within those organizations. So you're talking about self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, motivation, and social skill. Those are the 5 components that Daniel Goleman talks about when he talks about. So bolstering that, getting people to understand, getting out of their own way, they are the greatest barrier. How do you take that empathy that you have for my situation and say, oh, I feel sorry for those people, and turn it into action? Use your power and privilege to have empathy plus action, which is compassion. How do you start to use that? How do you start to understand how biases, stereotypes, limiting beliefs impede your decision-making process? What are your motivations? How do you start to really develop that emotional intelligence to capitalize on what Daniel Goleman talks about as being twice as important for organizations? That's the key to making your strategy work, and so that your culture does not completely eat it for lunch and have breakfast and dinner as well.
Really great call out. And I think that's one of the best pieces of advice for whether you are a new grad, you are like in the workforce for a while, or whatever it may be, like that emotional intelligence piece. It's really difficult to teach compared to some of the technical expertise. But like you said,
Yeah,
it's one of the most important skills that you'll need as you grow through your career path, right?
absolutely.
And I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to touch on your memoir slash leadership book, Can You Hear Me Now?
Yes.
And to provide a little bit of context for the audience, you talk about your childhood, life as a young Black woman entrepreneur, and your experience as a politician and first Black person elected to represent the federal riding of Whitby, Ontario.
Yeah.
And within this book, you show us that effective and humane leaders grow as much from their mistakes and vulnerabilities as from their strengths. And you know what? Like growing up as a visible minority and just thinking back a little bit from there, I was like, we're kind of conditioned not to fuck up, like, pardon my French there. And the whole concept of embracing mistakes and leveraging them as learnings is like something that I didn't learn until like maybe later in life. And it's honestly one of the hardest muscles to kind of exercise. So, can you
Yes.
share a little bit more about that mindset and how you got comfortable? Yeah. Yeah. And this is a video podcast, so everyone can see it too, right? For those watching on YouTube. So yeah, how did you get comfortable with embracing mistakes and vulnerabilities, especially when we're conditioned not to F up?
Yeah, so I think in chapter 8 of Can You Hear Me Now, I talk about being in that room and being interviewed for the governing council at the University of Toronto. And, as an immigrant child, I pulled the doctor card. Like, you have 5 choices. You could be a doctor, lawyer, accountant, whatever the 5 are. I pulled the doctor card as a child, and I was going to be a doctor. In fact, my mother gave me Ben Carson's Gifted Hands, and I was going to be a neurosurgeon. I wasn't just going to be, I was going to be like a brain surgeon. And going to university, I totally messed up through university. It took 6 years to finish a 3-year degree, graduated with a 1.58 GPA. One thing that you can't do with a 1.58 GPA is apply to med school. And so, long story short, I have a successful career. I started a company, have a really successful career, go back and become a member of the governing council at the University of Toronto. And during the interview, somebody asked me in the same room that I had failed one of my exams, virology or immunology. I think I failed the immunology exam in that room. There's 50 governors interviewing me for this position. And one of them says, when you look back over your life, do you have any regrets? And I'm like, what kind of question is this? I know, dude, did not just ask me that. And I'm a crier, so I immediately start to like well up with tears, and I'm like, and I can't speak. And it hits me. No, I don't regret anything. And if you read the book, I'm very candid. I'm very open. I list every single mistake I've ever made in my life, from like, you know, addiction, abortion, affairs, like they're all in here. And I say no. And it was a realization in that moment that my mistakes didn't own me. I made a mistake or several. And then I could choose what to do with it. And it's like the Buddhist, right? You could choose to take that mistake and suffer with it, keep it forever and say, look at my mistake, look at my mistake. And that is suffering. The pain of the mistake is almost immediate. You feel it and you can let it go. But you can hold on to it and suffer with it. And so at that moment, I decided the pain of the mistake is already gone. Am I going to hold on to it and suffer with it? Or am I going to plant it, grow it, learn from it, understand it? And I talk about Ms. Take. Ms. Take is the greatest teacher that I've ever had. Miss Take. And from her, you could have the pain, you could have the guilt, you could have the suffering. But then if you stay long enough with that Ms. Take, you could also learn the lesson. And the lesson is where you start to grow. When you release it and you say, this is no longer mine, I could talk about it. I'm not going to let it hold me hostage. It's a mistake. I'm not going to, whether I made it intentionally or not, it was a mistake. I'm learning from it. But if I let it hold me hostage, I will suffer. It will chew me up from the inside. So let it go. Talk about it. Don't be afraid of it. And then that's when you start to grow, when you understand why you made the mistake, what lesson it had to teach you, and how you could not make the same mistake going forward and make it a little bit better. So turn that pain into something very beautiful.
I appreciate you sharing that visual, because as I sit here with that thought, I'm just like, man, like the amount of times that I've sat in this vicious loop of like, all right, so I effed up here. I'm not gonna do this again. I could have done this. And then that over and over, and it's like exhausting. And then just trying to even be like, okay, you have 24 hours. After that, get over it and move on. Like you didn't kill anyone, right? Like just that. And so not letting that hold you hostage
Mm-mm.
and then flipping the switch is liberating, to be quite honest.
It's liberating, but you don't have to do it right away. Sometimes you just need to sit with it. So everybody's, oh, get back on the horse or you'll never ride again. Well, dude, maybe I'm not ready yet. I haven't learned the lesson. Let me just the only thing I say is, if you fall flat on your face, don't just stay there with your face in the mud. Turn over, put your hands behind your head, just chill for a minute, and then say, mistake, tell me what I'm supposed to learn from this. And it might not be for a while, but you've opened yourself up to learning. And that's all you need to do.
Not only is that applicable on an individual level, but also on an enterprise level, right? Because if you think about all the events that happen, but then the same mistakes keep on occurring over and over again, when individuals aren't empowered to then look at that and be like, okay, so like, why do we think this happened over and over again, right? And on the topic of mistakes and vulnerabilities, I've noticed that leaders are often scrutinized way more heavily than your average person, and because of the responsibilities that you have, right? Especially when you are a public facing leader, such as a member of
Okay.
parliament. So, looking back to your experience, what is one thing that has really helped you handle the pressure and the scrutiny that came with that responsibility and that role?
I think the one thing is remembering my why, which was also happened to be because I was an elected official, my how. How did I get there? The people. Why was I there? To serve people. And so I knew I was being scrutinized. I knew I was going to face intense, undue pressure because I'm a woman in politics, and I'm a woman of color in politics, and I'm a Black woman in politics. So I knew that this scrutiny was going to be uh, just so much more intense no matter what I said or did. And one of my rules is they're going to talk about you anyway. You might as well give them something good to talk about. So I didn't just take for granted that I could operate in that system in the same way everybody else did. Meaning, paper and you just read the piece of paper and you just, you be bobble-headed along and you vote the same way, you speak the same way, you do all the same things. I just couldn't do that. I was elected to serve the people of Whitby. And I was going to do that in a way that was authentic to Celina, knowing full well that they were going to talk about me either way. So I would sometimes take the notes that I was given and say, I can't read this, and then change everything, which the party hated. I would change it up. I would keep the message. I'd say, like, what are the three things you actually want me to say here? Take those three and then change it into something that was relatable to the people of Whitby. But I also had a bigger responsibility because I wasn't just the member of parliament for Whitby. I couldn't fade because I was not only the first Black woman elected in Whitby or Durham region, but I was the only Black female member of parliament elected in the entire 42nd parliament. So out of 338 people, I was the only one who looked like me. So I could not fade. And when you can't fade, you have a responsibility, not just to Whitby. I have a responsibility to women of color who are immigrants, who have mental health issues, who have disabilities, who are religious minorities, but all these intersecting identities. That responsibility fell here. And so if representation matters, I needed to speak to what mattered to the people I represented. So not only was I speaking to issues related to the people of Whitby, but I was also speaking about my mental health publicly. I was also speaking about race and racism publicly. I was also speaking about misogyny publicly because I knew that people that looked like me were having these same water cooler conversations on Mondays, right? And saying the party, those conversations are loud. But people that look like me and others, they were having those similar conversations in whispers. Did you hear what happened? Did you see what they did to me? Did you see what happened to that person? Did you hear that story? And I wanted to amplify those stories, amplify those messages through the biggest megaphone in the country, right? I wanted to make sure that the reason why I went to parliament with braids in my hair were to amplify those stories. People kept saying, why does hair matter? Hair matters because kids get expelled from school because of their hairstyle, because of their naturally growing hair. You know, racism is a thing that existed long before George Floyd. Misogyny is a thing that existed long before the Me Too movements. So let's have these conversations. And as the only Black woman elected out of 338 people, I was like, who better to have those? Who better to start those conversations than me?
Huge kudos to you for building that platform and then leveraging in a way where it makes such a positive impact on others, right? And I guess one last question that I have for you on this topic is for those who have dreamt about either going into prestigious leadership roles or into politics, what would you say is one of the harshest realities that you ended up coming across that was like completely opposite of what you could have even imagined?
The space, understanding that the space was not designed for you. You need to change your mindset a little bit. You go in and you're like, oh, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get this. And you're excited and you're like, and then you get in and they're like, oh God, whoa, wait, whoa. This parliament was not designed for women. They only very recently had women's washrooms installed. When I was there, they didn't have a dress code for women because we were not supposed to be there. And so then how do you operate in a space knowing full well that you are going in there challenged? And then you operate a little bit differently. And I was exposed very quickly to the structural violence that exists in those spaces. Not seeing yourself on the walls, having those cold sort of staring framed men like looking down at you, making you feel like you don't belong there. If you know you don't belong when you start off and you have that in your mindset, you're not surprised. Man, I was surprised. It was a shock. It was a shock to my system, it was a shock to my culture. There's no actual visual representation of the contributions of Black Canadians. And we've been here for over 400 years within the parliamentary precinct. Very little representation. And so I think that that does matter when you go into a space and the space itself is not warm and inviting and welcoming, because it actually tells you you are never supposed to show up here. But if you know that going in, you have a different mindset and a different expectation of this space.
And that's a huge testament to your strength, to be able to handle that and not be like, well, I'm just gonna walk right back the other way kind of feeling, right? So, as we slowly wrap up our conversation, one of my questions to you is, what do you think it takes to unleash the potential of individuals or organizations? Like, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
We have to be able to be our authentic selves. And that requires vulnerability. You said that word earlier, and as you said it as I was typing it, so I didn't bother saying it again. But it's so important that we leave space for that vulnerability, that space of unknowing. You know, the only reason that DEI could work, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, is when we leverage the diversity that exists. Meaning, after you have the diverse population within your organization, you actually have to build an inclusive practice. And inclusion is the ongoing intentional engagement with diversity, meaning have conversations, but be vulnerable enough to know that I don't know everything. And your experience is not invalid because it's not my experience. My experience is valid, and so is yours. They may be different. And that's how we could start complementing each other. We could start saying, well, your experience was a little harder. Mine was a little bit easier. I could tell you how to be easier, and I could tell you how to be more resilient. The ongoing intentional engagement allows you to leverage that diversity. And in those conversations, you start building those equitable practices, saying, this is what I need because of my situation, and this is what you need because of your situation. But ultimately, what we want to do is be vulnerable enough to drop our own barriers, our own limiting beliefs, biases, stereotypes, imposter syndrome, to be able to say, okay, now let's make this just. Let's make this place fair for everyone, irrespective of their identity. And that requires a vulnerability that starts with something as simple as a conversation. I'll drop one more book by Robert Livingston called The Conversation. Like, in reading that book and understanding the power of speaking to people with that sense of vulnerability, with that sense of just curiosity and wanting to know. And, Brene Brown says that vulnerability is the birthplace of creativity and innovation. You want that in your organization. You want that in your society. Let's become a little bit more vulnerable and make it happen.
Appreciate that call out, because it makes me think about a conversation I had recently with someone where she was like, you know what, a lot of the businesses that she works with, there's a huge difficulty in navigating the multi-generational workforce that is within there, because they're like, every generation within that workforce is so different, and then there's these communication gaps. But like you said, when you approach it from curiosity, vulnerability, you start engaging the strengths of these different generations that ultimately help you as an organization, because those different individuals bring something that another generation can't, right?
Yes.
And
Irrespective of the identity,
yes,
have those conversations, but be vulnerable enough to know that you don't know everything.
love that. And my last question to you is, what's one thing that you're working on that you are super excited about?
My PhD. Yeah, I'm doing a phenomenological study on basically mirroring my experience in politics, but looking at that as a theory towards developing a praxis of humanization. So, how do we get to be vulnerable enough, understand our awakening enough to know that to be more human with each other, to see each other's humanity, and to stop talking about DEI as if it's the end all be all, but to go beyond it towards looking at our humanity and developing a a practical real world applications to making sure that we do that on a sustainable long term across the globe level.
I can't wait to see the outcome of that because what I realize is that when it comes to DEI in itself, what is given to us can be taken away versus what you're doing
Yeah.
is it's beyond that. And
Yeah.
that's why I'm like, I can't wait to see like what comes out of that.
Thank you. I'm really
Yeah.
excited about it. So I'm glad I got that question. Thank you.
Well, Celina, thank you so much for sharing your story, your expertise, and to everyone else who's tuned into this episode, thank you for your time and attention. It means more to me than you'll ever know. And I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.